When the sea comes home. In the end, the sea never arrives from outside. It rises from within.
The voice of fate. The gods do not speak to all, only to those foolish enough to listen. In the heart of Hellas, among the hills where the air was thick with incense and the sun scorched the marble, stood the temple of Apollo, a place where kings, warriors, merchants, and beggars had flocked for centuries. It was said that here, beneath the vaults of the cave, fate itself whispered in people's ears, and the voice of the gods resounded through the lips of a woman whose eyes had long since ceased to see this world. She was called Pythia. Her breath was the smoke of laurel, her words a knife that cut the future. That day the temple was overflowing. A dusty crowd stood waiting for a new visitor. Not a king, not a warrior, but a merchant named Nerion. He was renowned in port cities for his skill at bargaining, for a mind that could count coins faster than prayers. For him, the divine did not exist, only agreement and profit. But he had not come here of his own free will. A week earlier, he'd heard a voice in a dream, feminine, cold. "You will be the one who outsmarts fate." The dream seemed so real that in the morning he couldn't look at himself in the mirror with anxiety. The servants said he was pale, like a man returning from the dead. He entered the temple, which smelled of wax and aged stone. The Pythia sat in the depths, shrouded in smoke. She didn't see him, but she spoke first. "You seek proof that we are a lie, but a lie requires faith to survive. You believe, then I am real."
The crowd murmured. Nerion chuckled. "I don't believe," he said. "I am observing. If the gods truly speak through you, let them tell me what I don't know." The Pythia raised her head. Her voice became muffled, like the sound of the wind in the mountains. "You will live a long life, but your end will come from what you fear most." The temple fell silent. Someone crossed themselves, and Nerion laughed. "So, I should just stop being afraid, and then I'll conquer fate." The Pythia didn't answer. She only whispered, "You've already begun to fear." On the way back, he walked up the stone steps, feeling the chill from the marble penetrate his sandals. The crowd parted before him. Some looked on with pity, others with superstitious horror. But Nerion walked with his head held high. He told himself that he would not be a slave to the words of a woman intoxicated by smoke and glory. He would prove that fate was not the will of the gods, but the result of calculation. "If I control fear, I control fate," he thought. However, that night, when the footsteps in the house faded, he suddenly heard a distant sound, as if someone were quietly calling his name. He went to the window. The sea shimmered below, black, silent, alive. And somewhere deep within, on the border between sleep and waking life, a whisper sounded, "You cannot escape what you cannot name." From then on, Nerion never mentioned the temple again. He laughed at rumors, made new deals, bought land. But sometimes, when he sealed the scroll with another contract, his hand trembled, as if, deep in his subconscious, he was already signing a pact with fate. The fear. Every prophecy begins with fear and ends when fear becomes truth. 3 moons had passed since Nerion left the Temple of Apollo. He returned to his home, a marble villa at the foot of a hill overlooking the sea. Once, this view had inspired him. Now, it unsettled him. The light reflected off the water seemed not like sunlight, but alive, as if the sea itself were watching him. He avoided looking toward the horizon, where it disappeared into a silver haze. In the evenings, the shutters were closed, even when the house was stuffy. The servants whispered, "The master fears the light." But Nerion knew he feared not the light, but the depths. At night, he was awakened by sounds, quiet but insistent, as if someone were walking barefoot on the water, slowly, rhythmically. He got up and went out into the courtyard, but it was empty. Only a dry wind touched the grass, and the house fell asleep again. He tried to convince himself that all this was the effects of fatigue, an echo of that meeting in the temple. But deep in his soul, where reason loses its power, a seed of fear sprouted. Small, barely noticeable, but alive. During the day, he talked with philosophers and friends, convincing them and himself that fate existed only in the mind. Gods are created by fear. He who is not afraid becomes a god himself, he said, with a smile, raising his goblet of wine. But every morning, the first thing he did was check the moisture level on the walls. Sometimes he imagined the stone was slightly damp, even though there had been no rain for weeks. He stopped bathing. Only servants brought water in jugs, and even then, under supervision. Nerion drank little and ate dry food. The servants joked, "The master himself will soon become stone." But one day, one of them whispered, "He who flees from water thirsts for it most of all." The phrase stuck in his head like a splinter.
One night, Nerion awoke with a strange sensation, as if the house was breathing. The air was thick, heavy. He took a lamp and walked through the halls. A thin layer of moisture glistened in a crack in the marble floor. He ran his finger along it, salty. His heart pounded. He ordered sand to be brought and filled in the crack. The next morning, it was dry, as if nothing had happened. But the following night, the water appeared again, this time closer to his bedroom. It didn't flow, didn't drip. It was simply there, like a breath behind him. He ordered the masons to be called, to seal all the floors, walls, even the well. He said he was protecting the house from dampness, but he himself understood. He was protecting himself from a prophecy. From then on, his house became like a fortress, silent, lightless, with no windows facing the sea. Only the wind occasionally howled through the cracks, and it seemed as if the voice of the Pythia whispered through the stone, "You did not escape fate, you paved its way." One particularly hot night, Nerion went to the window and finally opened the shutters. The sea lay motionless, like a mirror. He stared at it for a long time, unblinking. And suddenly, in the reflection of the water, he seemed to see his own face. But the eyes of the reflected one were wider open than his own, and they were smiling. He stepped back, closed the shutters, and pressed his back against the wall. His heart pounded loudly in his chest. This is not fear, he told himself. This is only the shadow of a dream. But somewhere deep inside, he felt the fear was no longer outside. It was within him, like still water that had found a crack.
The stranger from the shore. Fate never knocks, it whispers, until you open the door yourself. The day began calmly. The air was thick, still, saturated with salt. Nerion stood on the terrace, looking out to sea. It looked deceptively peaceful. Not a single cloud, not a breath of wind, only a strange feeling that the horizon was getting closer. He hadn't been down to the shore in a long time. Servants brought news from the market, food, wine, everything he needed to stay within the walls. But that morning, when the sun was especially high and the shadows were disappearing, he suddenly felt an irresistible urge to leave the house. He hesitated long time, as if battling an invisible enemy. Finally, he said to himself, "If I'm running from fate, then I'm already in its power. So be it." He walked down the dusty road to the shore. The sand was hot, crunching under his sandals. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, a smell he once loved. Where the waves lazily lapped the rocks, a man stood, tall, thin, wearing a gray cloak. He didn't move. It seemed he was simply waiting. As Nerion approached, the stranger turned. His face was hidden by a hood, but his lips were visible, dry and cracked like rainless earth. He spoke slowly, quietly, as if from afar. "You haven't come down here for a long time, Nerion." "How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice betraying him, sounding quieter than he intended. "I know all who seek answers from the gods, and all who think they've deceived them." The wind picked up. The waves began to whisper, as if echoing the stranger's voice. He bent down and picked up a piece of obsidian from the sand, black, smooth as a mirror. He said, "You sealed your home from the water, but water always finds a way, even into the heart."
Nerion was silent. It seemed to him that the stone emanated a chill, as if it were breathing. "Who are you?" "Just a messenger. Where men hear the sound of the sea, I hear the steps of fate." The stranger held out the obsidian. Nerion didn't want to take it, but his fingers reached out of their own accord. The stone was icy, and a face was reflected in it, but not his. The reflected eyes looked straight at him, and suddenly the lips of this reflection moved, silently. But he understood the words, "You're already in the water." He abruptly tossed the stone aside. It fell into the sand, but didn't sink. It simply vanished, as if it had never been there. The stranger took a step back. "You tried to deceive the prophecy, but fate is not a command. It is a mirror. Everything you avoid becomes your reflection." And without waiting for an answer, he walked toward the sea. Nerion shouted, "Stop! Who are you?" He didn't answer. He entered the water, not stopping until the waves covered his head. And only for a moment did Nerion see the surface of the sea did not move, as if
no one had entered it. He stood for a long time, motionless. Then he suddenly realized his feet were wet. The waves didn't touch the shore, but the sand around him was warm and damp. He looked down. A thin stream of water trickled from beneath his footprints, flowing back to the sea. Then he remembered the words of the Pythia spoken on the day she announced the prophecy. "You will not perish by the hand of man, but water remembers names." He looked up. At the horizon, the light grew brighter, too bright, blinding, and suddenly it seemed to him that the sea was smiling.
The flood within. Sometimes water doesn't drown, it remembers. After meeting the stranger, Nerion didn't sleep for 3 nights. Everything in the house felt strange. Even the walls, once dry and rough, now seemed damp, as if they were breathing salt. He lit lamps, opened the shutters, but in every corner he saw a reflection unlike his own. During the day, he tried to convince himself that it was all fatigue, an old fear, an echo of a prophecy. But at night he heard drops. One, pause, another, rhythmic like a heart. He rose, searching for the source, but the floor was dry. On the 4th night, the smell of the sea awakened him. Not a light breeze, not freshness, but a thick, heavy smell of rot and depth, as if the house stood right on the ocean floor. He stepped out into the hallway. The torchlight wavered, reflecting off the walls. Splash. He stopped. The sound came from behind the door at the end, a room he had never visited since he'd settled here. His hand trembled as he pulled the ring. The door opened, and inside stood water. Not a puddle, a veritable lake, smooth, black, with a mirror-like surface. Not a single spring, not the sound of dripping. He took a step inside, and the room sighed, as if the walls had stretched, yielding to the breath of an invisible sea. The light from the torch trembled, reflected in the water, and in the reflection, he saw himself, but not as he was now. There, young, confident, in the very armor in which he'd first visited the oracle. "What have you done?" asked the reflected figure. Nerion didn't answer.
Did you think you could cheat fate without paying the price? Ripples began to form in the reflection, and from its center a silhouette rose. The same stranger from the shore, but now his face was clearly visible. It was his own. "I am not a stranger," said a voice, as if coming from within the water. "I am what you became when you stopped believing in the gods." He tried to retreat, but the water was already touching his feet. Cold as death, and yet strangely inviting. He felt it pulling him down, not physically, but from within. Every memory, every regret, every lie became a drop, filling him. "You will not drown," the voice whispered. "You will dissolve." And suddenly everything was gone. He stood in the middle of a dry room. The torch burned steadily. No water. Only the wet imprint of a hand remained on the wall, and from it a single drop slowly trickled. She fell to the floor, and the sound of her fall made Nerion's heart clench, because somewhere far away, from the depths of the earth,
Thousands of other drops answered her, as if the entire sea had remembered his name. He closed his eyes. The face of the Pythia floated before his mind's eye. To run is to swim backwards, and he who swims against fate drowns within himself. When he opened his eyes again, a vase of flowers stood on the floor. He hadn't brought them, but the stems were already in the water.
The house became quieter than ever. Nerion stopped hearing footsteps, the breath of the wind, even the sound of the distant sea. The silence was so thick, as if the air itself had frozen in anticipation. He hadn't slept for days. He tried to write, read, pray, but his thoughts flowed like sand through his fingers. Everything returned to one thing: water. He dreamed of it every night, transparent, black, green, bottomless. Sometimes he saw it climbing the stairs, and sometimes pouring from his own eyes. One morning, he woke to a strange sensation: a breathing floor. The boards beneath him were slightly warm and damp. He lowered his feet and heard a soft, wet squelch. "No," he breathed. "This can't be." He rushed to the window. Behind him, everything was the same: the sun, the dusty road, the dried-up olive trees. No clouds, no rain. But when he turned around, moisture was creeping along the walls, slowly, persistently, like a living thing. It rose, leaving traces like hands. He retreated until his back touched the door, but a thin ray of light was already breaking through the crack beneath it, a light that shimmered in waves. "You built a house on the earth," a familiar voice rang out, "but you yourself became its sea." He froze. A man in a gray cloak stood before him, his face hidden again. But now a radiance emanated from him, as if from within. I deceived the oracle," Nerion whispered. "I did the opposite. I avoided the water." "You avoided it outside and let it in," the voice replied. Then he understood. All the years he'd lived in fear, fleeing from the prophecy, he himself had become its vessel. The water didn't come, it waited for him to fill. He felt the air grow damp. His breathing grew heavy. Steam escaped his mouth as if the house had suddenly grown cold. He approached the mirror. The reflection no longer mirrored his movements. There, on the other side of the glass, stood a man calm, without fear, but his eyes were deep, blue as the sea. "Now you understand," he said. "The oracle never spoke of death. He spoke of return." The glass cracked, and water gushed from each one, first streams, then torrents. They enveloped Nerion, caught him, lifted him. He didn't resist. He merely closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he breathed easily, as if with every drop touching my skin, fear, doubt, and loneliness disappeared. When all was quiet, the house was empty. On the floor lay a still, mirror-like surface of water, and only in its reflection could I still see the silhouette of a man standing on the shore, and next to it lay the same black obsidian. On its surface, where once stood a strange face, now lay a calm sea. No man truly outwits the oracle. He simply learns the language of his own prophecy.